Thank you, everyone, and thank you in particular to our friends at the Lombardy Energy Clean Tech Cluster for inviting me today. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with everyone. So I just wanted to do two quick things for this morning. One is introduce very briefly the role that we play at the World Economic Forum. I know not everyone is necessarily very familiar with how we operate and what we do and how we can contribute to the energy transition. So just spending a few minutes on that. And then I wanted to focus on one of the many initiatives that we have, because I think it's one of the most relevant to our conversation this morning. And it's about decarbonizing industrial clusters and helping them move towards net zero emissions. So I'll take a few minutes to do that as well. And hopefully that gives you a good sense of how we can contribute. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Can you move to the next slide, please? So while we do that, basically, this is just the introduction. The World Economic Forum is the international organization for public and private cooperation. So thank you very much. Our mission is to improve the state of the world. And the way we do that is we bring basically together stakeholders from all of the sectors of society to shape the future for better and to generate impact through communities and platforms. And I'll get to that in a second. If you can move to the next slide. So there's a few things that we do. We try and shape the agenda. We try and inform decision and guide strategy, and also and more we're actually geared towards delivering collective action and impact. And so on these three categories that you're seeing here, we have a number of what we call platforms, which are essentially communities of actors geared toward delivering a specific result for a particular topic. So if you move to the next slide, I can give you a concrete example as to the way we operate in the energy, materials, and infrastructure space. Next slide, please. So I myself belong to the platform for shaping the future of energy, materials, and infrastructure. And we really know that today energy, materials, infrastructure are the foundation of economic growth. But there are huge pressures right now being exercised on these sectors from the financial perspective, obviously from the climate perspective, and from the emissions kind of side. And so the question really is, how do we support that transition to enable economic and social growth, but without harming the environment? That's what we have at the heart of our kind of business model and operation. And so the platform really enables business, governments, and society to grow sustainable economies, while not accelerating, actually trying to halt climate change. You can see on the right-hand side that we work with a number of great companies, and I thought this particular statement and quote from Francesco Starace, who's the CEO of Enel, that you know extremely well, would be a useful way to illustrate some of the impact we can do. If you can move to the next slide, just very quickly to highlight the kind of four key pillars that we have, and then I'll get specifically to the initiative that I want to introduce today. So the way we operate is we have those four kind of pillars of activities around country transition and benchmarking, net zero carbon cities, industrial transition, which I'll focus on, and growth markets. But just to mention that these four areas are really the four key pillars that we leverage to really kind of shift the system from where we are today to an accelerated, equitable, and sustainable energy transition for all. We look at what needs to happen in countries, and we look at how they are faring against one another. We look at how we transition cities and urban environments and ecosystem, which is absolutely critical to get the transition operational. We look at how we transition core industries that includes, all of the so-called hard-to-abate sectors: steel, cement, trucking, shipping, aviation, and in particular the ones that are materials related, so cement and aluminum also. And then we look at the potential growth markets, so what needs to happen in specific regions of the world to facilitate growth without necessarily fostering additional emissions. So if you can move to the next slide, I'll just now say a few words on one of the specific initiatives that I wanted to introduce, which is this one related to industrial clusters. So we have today up to 70% of global GDP represented in countries that have already committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And so industrial clusters will really play a key role in making sure that we achieve those climate ambitions. Now, industrial clusters are regions where supply and demand are co-located, and so enable low carbon solutions to be scaled by aggregating demand from major energy consumers without the need for long distance transport infrastructure. Now, industry emissions today represent approximately 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so you can see here the potential for abatement that lies in there. They are some of the hardest to abate given the technical and commercial complexities, for instance, such as high heat requirements, but also low margin businesses. So geographic regions comprised of companies representing one or more industries co-located in close proximity, representing approximately 2/3 of industrial emissions. That's almost 20% of global emissions. If you can move to the next slide. In March 2021 of this year, the World Economic Forum, together with Accenture, released a report which detailed 4 key solutions for clusters to utilize and to find their optimal balance and to really get to decarbonization. So they include systemic efficiency and circularity, direct electrification and renewable heat, hydrogen, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And so basically, if you kind of utilize these 4 major areas, depending on where you are, what you do, and the composition of the geography or the regulatory kind of jurisdiction where your cluster operates, there is a significant potential for decarbonizing emissions. Industry itself can be broadly characterized into heavy and light industry based primarily on an energy kind of intensity criteria. Heavy industries is basically refining, chemicals, cement, steel, for instance, and light is more, areas such as food processing, paper and pulp, manufacturing, or electronics. Light industries represent approximately 50% of industrial emissions, but they're usually easier to abate, mostly via the electrification route. So it's the top right quadrant that you're seeing here, mostly because there's low heat requirements. But on the other hand, heavy industries is harder to abate, and that's mostly because you require high temperature heat requirements, which cannot be delivered through electrification. And that's why you need solutions such as, for instance, hydrogen or carbon capture, utilization and storage. I wanted to highlight maybe a quick example just to give a bit of color to this, and that's on the next slide. It's a UK-based example, which is in the Humber region. But before I do that, I also wanted to highlight the fact that we are working today already with a number of Italian companies. I can name a few, maybe NI or NL, for instance. I don't know if there are representatives in the room. On kind of this initiative too, we will be announcing a few kind of plans at COP26 later in the month of November, but so far nothing is just firmed up yet. So I just wanted to kind of highlight this. But so as far as this zero carbon Humber is concerned, just to give you an idea of how, the potential that's in there. The Humber industrial clusters is the UK's largest cluster by industrial emissions. It emits over 10 million tons of CO2 per year. That's almost 2% of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions. It has industries such as steel, chemicals, cement, oil refining. So zero carbon Humber that you can see here is one of the few major projects being undertaken in the region to accelerate emissions reductions and being led by major companies such as, in this case, Equinor, SSE, British Steel, and Drax, just to name but a few. Zero carbon Humber aims to establish the world's first net zero industrial cluster by 2040, so even before 2050, mostly via the creation of CCS infrastructure, but also production of blue and green hydrogen. So if you think of the quadrant that I showed you before, basically the 2 kind of solutions in the bottom. Now, Industrial users will be able to reduce emissions by switching to low carbon hydrogen produced and transported within the cluster, or via capturing carbon and transporting it via shared pipelines to offshore storage sites. And so it's just a great example of how private companies are working together to achieve a common goal, which is to reduce emissions. A final word to say that indeed the World Economic Forum, together with Accenture, will launch this initiative at COP26 in November, hoping really to create a global movement to accelerate the transformation of industrial clusters towards net zero emissions. This will include presentation from key global clusters with annual emissions hopefully totaling 30 million tons, so equivalent to the emissions of the size of Denmark. And so those clusters who have already announced ambitious commitments and are leading the way as part of the initiative. And hopefully we hope that we will generate a strong movement to get commitments from additional clusters from across the globe, including maybe in the Lombardy region area. So thank you very much for your time, for your attention. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you an excellent success for the rest of the conference. Back to you.